Just the idea of walking out of this theater and having heads on the fence or bodies that are crucified.
Which is
I mean,
impossible to imagine.
It's
Yeah.
truly,
Yeah.
truly unimaginable.
Yeah.
And so to sort of shy away from that, I think would be doing injustice to the fear and horror that they live with every
Yeah.
single day.
Yeah.
At the same time, I didn't want people running out of movie theaters.
No.
And so, every single frame, every single cut point, every single sound was argued about, discerned, and debated in the edit room. And I don't know, it's up to you to decide, but hopefully we struck some sort of balance between those two things.
I was very interested how it felt for you moving from Cartelland to this film where you're following a group of guys, but you are slightly reliant on the action coming in through them, or the way in which you can give us that broader sense of what is going on in Raqqa is coming through them, rather than you having the kind of control in your hand of being on the front line. How did that feel as the director?
First of all, thank you guys all for coming. It was a totally different experience for me. I think with Cartelland, I was in extraordinary amounts of danger. I was in shootouts, I was in meth labs, I was in torture chambers, places that I never could have ever imagined ever being in. And with this film, as you say, I was a step removed. I never saw dead bodies, I never saw guns, I never saw ISIS. But ISIS was omnipresent at all times. And so the fear was just a much different type of fear. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges in this film, is that for the stuff that I filmed, which was outside of Syria, because if I had gone to Raqqa, I would have been killed instantly, which I didn't particularly want to do. I was basically constrained in these safe houses. Moving from safe house to safe house, and that was one of the biggest challenges, trying to find the cinema, trying to find the drama, trying to find the humanity
in restricted circumstances.
For the most part were these smoky boxes with guys behind computers and cell phones. And so from the first time I stepped in there, I knew that was my challenge, was how to make this dramatic.
Yeah. And in a different way, I suppose you had in Cartelland you were responsible for your own safety, and although the Raqqas being silently slaughtered team were outside Syria, there was still the understanding of the perceived threat following them around is very real and tangible. Was that an added layer of kind of preoccupation and anxiety for you in terms of drawing attention to them, or did you manage to keep it very under the radar in terms of production?
From the very beginning, when I first approached the guys, I was very transparent with the types of films that I make, the type of film that I wanted to make, which was, a very intimate, visceral journey as they were escaping from Syria to Turkey and Turkey to Europe. And then what are the ramifications of that? What are the ramifications of filming in these safe houses? How do we communicate? How do I get there? How do I get out of there? And then obviously, or most obviously probably, what are the ramifications of when the film comes out and their faces, are all over the, cinemas across the world and however people watch films these days, and so are they okay with that? And I think they looked at each other and said, we want to come out from behind the veneer of social media. We don't want to be avatars anymore. We want to, show that we're moderate Muslim men from Raqqa. And I think that's, so often in media and film, you're either a terrorist or a victim. And there's a whole vast majority of people who are neither.
Yeah, simply the idea of class, when they describe themselves as we're kind of relatively wealthy middle class boys, gives us a whole kind of extra dimension about the kind of people behind this work in the first place.
Yeah, and that was really, really important to me to humanize them in a way that, so often they get stereotyped. And so, those moments of brotherhood, of love, when they're hugging each other, when they first, come together in that scene in the third act of the film, when they're in the snowball fight, the moment in the subway when the teacher and his wife are flirting, just these small moments of humanity were were key to me to not make them caricatures.
To what extent in the course of the production did you start to become interested in this? You know, obviously there's the horrific violence going on day by day, but this modern contemporary PR activity in the digital sphere for ISIS is a very kind of interesting development to explore.
That was actually sort of the intellectual hook for me for the film.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by this sort of war of ideas, this war of propaganda, this war of information between ISIS's, you know, Hollywood-style slick propaganda on one side, and then RBSS's content on the other. And so that's really what drew me in. But I think, you know, one of the reasons I love making documentaries is sort of being open to the story evolving and changing. And for me, the film over time became much more than that. It became a story of you know, finding oneself in a new land. It became an immigrant story as they're forced to flee. It became a story of rising nationalism in Europe, which obviously has echoes to what's happening in the U.S. It became a story of trauma in the cumulative effects of trauma that we see so vividly in that final scene in the film.
To what extent were you conscious of striking the balance between the guys as a unit and the work they're doing and the broader picture of the kind of horror of ISIS?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that was one of the hardest things for sure in the edit room was sort of making these sort of parallel narratives seamless, or at least attempting to. I knew also from the beginning that I wanted the through line to be this exodus as they're escaping from safe house to safe house. While I also knew that I wanted to cut back and forth to life inside Raqqa to show the horrors of what was happening. And some of that, you know, was obviously footage from the group themselves, and some of that was ISIS footage. And, you know, I'm sure someone's going to ask, so I'll just answer it anyway. You know, the sort of one of the hardest things was to find that balance of the violence. Because for me, it would have been doing an injustice to the people of Raqqa to not show it. You know, just the idea of walking out of this theater and having heads on the fence or bodies that are crucified.
Which is
I mean,
impossible to imagine.
It's truly unimaginable.
Yeah.
And so to sort of shy away from that, I think would be doing injustice to the fear and horror that they live with every single day.
Yeah.
At the same time, I didn't want people running out of movie theaters.
No.
And so, you know, every single frame, every single cut point, every single sound was argued about, discerned, and debated in the edit room. And I don't know, it's up to you to decide, but hopefully we struck some sort of balance between those two things. The how do you fix it question. Look, if I had the answer to that, then I probably wouldn't be sitting on the stage here. I'd be in some position of power. It's so complicated. You know, it's a 6-year civil war. It's a proxy war between the U.S., Russia, Iran, Turkey, you know, parts of the EU. It's a vacuum of power through which ISIS and other extremist groups have taken hold. So there's no silver bullet. There's no, like, you remove Assad and it's fixed, or you remove ISIS and it's fixed. It's so endlessly complicated. And, you know, I'm an eternal optimist, and I wish I had more hope in the immediate future, but I don't really. You know, I think there's a series of not great options in the future. And I think the sad thing is, you know, which you may or may not know, is that, you know, as we speak, there's a ground offensive led by the Syrian Democratic Forces to retake Raqqa from ISIS, and supported by the U.S., which with a conglomerate of different militia groups. You know, and it could be weeks, it could be months until ISIS is ousted from Raqqa. But I think, as Aziz says in the film, and as I learned in making this film, is that, you know, bombs and weapons are not going to fix this problem. That this ideology lives in a whole generation of children. It lives in a whole generation of people all across the world who've been indoctrinated by this way of thinking, and I think we as a global community, as governments, as citizens, as journalists, filmmakers, we need to figure out ways in which we can combat ISIS and this extremism as an idea, not just as a military force. And I think the work of RBSS is one very important step in that direction. So I first got in touch with them through an organization that we shared in common, the Committee to Protect Journalists. And yeah, I mean, it was very, very difficult to communicate sort of this is by far the hardest film that I've ever made, largely due to just basic logistics, sort of how to get there, how to communicate through encrypted means, with, at least at first, a group of guys that didn't really want to be filmed. I mean, they were open to me, they warmed to me, but at first, they were an extraordinary amount of danger and fear, and to let someone into their into the inner circle was very, very difficult. But I think, again, as I said earlier, my goal, and I think one of the values of documentary film is to sort of take these very large, complicated issues and put a human face to it. And I feel like that's my job and my duty to do that. And I need intimacy to be able to do that. And that intimacy doesn't happen just by sort of, knocking on their door and saying, can I hang out with you and have lunch for a day? Like, it happens after weeks and weeks and months and months and months of relationship building and rapport building. And eventually, hopefully, I become a part of the fabric of their daily lives, which is what happened. And that final scene of the film, again, never would have happened in the first couple weeks or months of filming. That was way at the end of filming, and by far the hardest thing that I've ever experienced as a human or filmmaker, because as a human being, all I wanted to do was give Aziz a hug and comfort him. But I knew that my job was also to capture this moment, to capture, they carry themselves with such stoicism, and they've been through such trauma. And so it was really important to me to try to understand the effects that trauma had on them. Yeah, I mean, that's the hardest question always in a documentary, is when to stop. Sometimes you run out of money, sometimes, and I think as you I've done this a couple of times now, that you have that sort of spider sense of when the film is arced, and it's always about finding that arc point. And for me, as you said, it was Aziz, and there was that final moment that I knew that I had a film. I didn't think I actually had a film before that, but I knew that when I had that moment, that I had at least an emotional arc to hang the film off of. And then, and I knew I had the journey, which was also an arc that had been completed, but it was really important to me to have that emotional arc too. And so once I got that scene, I mean, I still filmed a little bit after that, but that was sort of when I knew that it was near the beginning of the end. Yeah, look, I'm not like a social scientist or an expert in these matters per se. I think they use the sort of veneer of religion to some degree to attract people. They use these videos as a way to make people feel like they're can be part of something really important. They attract a lot of disenfranchised people to feel like they're going to belong to something. Some people just have gone just for the adventure of it. It's a whole range of reasons why people have either gone to, fight for ISIS in Iraq or Libya or Syria, or committed, horrible acts, obviously most recently in this country. And I think that's, again, at the heart of it is this ideology and this ideological war that we need to try to really spend time figuring out. And one example is, besides obviously what we hopefully see here in the film is, Google is doing a lot of work with an initiative called Jigsaw, through which they're sort of reverse engineering Google searches. So 2 years ago, you search ISIS, how to join ISIS, and within 2 seconds, you can basically get to Jordan or build a bomb or whatever. Now, when you search ISIS, how to join ISIS, how to support ISIS, it's virtually impossible to find that stuff now. And content like the content from RBSS, counter program, if you will, comes up way higher in the feed. So I don't know, people join for a lot of different reasons, and it's not just religious. No, I think they're deeply saddened by what's happened to their country, and I think that's a sad thing in all these conflicts, is that the only real losers are the citizens of Syria who just want to live in a peaceful, safe place. 500,000 plus people have been killed since the revolution. And it's very unclear when they'll be able to go back, if ever they'll be able to go back to Raqqa, even if ISIS is kicked out. And I think, it could be a decade before they're ever able to go back. And I think this wasn't necessarily the goal of the film, but I think so often this debate about immigration is so sort of one-dimensional, and I think one of my hopes with this film is to show that really humanize the experience of why people are leaving, how people are leaving, and what they're leaving. That's the last thing in the world they want to do is leave Raqqa. They love Raqqa, and so but they're forced to leave.